Hello and welcome to Dubai Trains, and we're finally going to paint the barge, the Walther's kit. And after watching this video, you will know exactly which colors I used, what I used them for, which sequence I used them, and how I applied them, so you can do all this yourself and recreate the result that I have. So the chart you see right now explains everything, and we're just going to go through it step by step. But before painting, we need to prime the barge. So for that, I use a Rust-Oleum spray can, and I sprayed it in gray because I want the undertone of the barge to be gray, have the effect of a rusty old gray barge. So we're going to start by applying a base coat over the primer. And I want it to be a rusty barge, so it's going to be 50% burnt sienna and 50% burnt umber. So I mix those two colors up, and then I'm going to sponge it on into the entire barge. So for that I use these cheap makeup sponges, and I take the biggest possible surface that the sponge can provide because it's such a big barge. And I rip off pieces of the sponge just to create a little bit more random effect. And then we start sponging. You just have to sponge the entire barge. And you can see immediately we're really getting close to the base coat color that we want to have. So do note I coat the entire barge with this color, the bottom, left side, top, everywhere. Or maybe not the bottom. And then I let it dry overnight, and then I give it a second coat of exactly the same color in almost all places except just a few areas. I wanted the gray to peek through as a less rusted spot on the barge. So here you see the result, and it looks good at first glance. But if you zoom in a bit, you see that under these little foundation plates where the track should be, the paint didn't get there. The sponge just didn't get into that corner. So I then applied a wash, especially to all these places, just to get the paint in that corner. But in some instances, this left a mark, as you see here. And that's not really something I wanted. So I just went over basically with the same base coat of the 50-50 burnt umber and sienna and just dabbed that away. And as you see now, it actually gave a really nice random effect, but some of these foundation plates have this rust ring around them and others don't. That's a nice accidental find. So after applying the base coat, we want to give some accents in different shades. So I want to give a lighter shade, and for that I'm going to use raw sienna. And I'm going to be very careful where I put that on because it's quite a strong contrast between the colors that we put on before. So as you see here, I'm really just dabbing it randomly with a smaller sponge than before, in places where I think the rust would build up. So maybe a dent in the barge where the water would puddle up, or something along those lines. And after that, you want to give that shade an accent to have a little bit more gradual transition from one color to the other, and to just give a little bit more detailing than just one color. And for the accent of the shade, we're going to use antique gold. So as you see now, I'm looking up the locations where I put the shade, and around the edges of the shade, and sometimes a little bit in the middle of the shade, I'm adding this accent color. And I'm also adding it to these vent holes. I don't think they're vent holes really, but let's call them vent holes, just to accent those a little bit. So you can see we're really giving a little bit of a spotty pattern to this massive rusty steel surface. So after a shade on the light side, I also want to give a shade on the dark side. So for that, I'm going to use the bittersweet chocolate color. This is really my new favorite color. And it's the same step, but also have a look at prototypical photo, especially for the side of the barge. And there I noticed that the bottom end that basically sits in the water most of the time, or is around the water edge, is much darker than the rest. So that's an effect that I'm applying right here. And I'm also putting the dark shades on top where there wouldn't be any puddles of water sitting. And then it's the same story with that dark shade. I want a dark accent, and that's going to be antique maroon. So that was the base coat, and then the light and dark shade with the accompanying accent color. And here you see the results. And I think the trick is a bit to not make it too patterny, not go too wild, and to just blend it in a little bit. Because sure, you can go wild and use a brush and really add smaller patches of all these colors that we just discussed. But I think then it's just going to distract a bit from the rest of the scene that you're trying to make. Second tip I have is work outside in. That's why I made this chart. So start with it when the lighter shades, start with the accent, and then add the shade to maybe cover up a bit of that antique gold that was too much. But on the dark side, start with the shade and then apply the accent to that. Now don't forget the details. These cleats and other hooks, they were yellow as per the prototype. So don't forget to paint them yellow and then apply some light rust over them to make them blend in a little bit more. So now we've painted the entire barge, but we're missing something obvious: track. So now let's have a look at this section, and in particular the track. And a few of you guys have asked to make a video or section on how to actually lay the track. It's really straightforward, so I don't really know what to say. Other than you take a piece of track, so we'll just lay this section right here, for example. And the first thing you want to do is you want to really gently bend it in more or less the right shape. So, and do this really gently. You see, just a little bit of force creates a curve, and then you'll get quite handy with this. As you see, it's almost first time right. What you also want to be doing is make sure that the ends are straight and neat. So as you see, the other end of this track is the straight section that the pliers cut straight, and this one is not. So cut this again with the plier, just cut a nip of it off. Take a file it, and as you see in the close-up pictures right now, you want to also file the underneath side of the rails away to make it a bit more pointy and rounded. And then once you have that and this end is neat, you just put it in place. So this is how I did it. So I just take my track snipping pliers, align them with the barge, so the flat end is towards the inside, indent it a bit, make a mark so I know where I need to cut, then just pick it up, get the pliers, position it properly, make a clean cut, file that, and then that's done. And I did all those pieces first, made them all separately. So I have, for example, here's a more, I don't know if it's complex, but a different piece that goes down here, and it has two bends in it. So you want to really get those in there first, because otherwise the gluing of the track will be way more difficult if the track is fighting the position it has to be in. And so yeah, you get that, then that's done. And then the final stage is to just glue it down. Now you might be thinking, we have these footprints here, so the space is going to be correct anyways. Yeah, partially true, because if your track is like this in the foundation and it's not straight, but it's a little bit under an angle like that because of paint that's heaping up or because you didn't press it in well, then you see it's already going to be a little bit out of alignment. And if the left track bends to the left and the right track bends to the right, well, then you're going to be wildly out of spec, or the other way around. So you do want to get that right. So you just get one or two of these. They're not cheap, but it is actually what you need. So that's what I'm doing right now. I'm just gluing everything down. So if we talk a little bit about track, I think we need to talk about the apron and the land side track as well. This was a bit more tricky to get into place. I already showed and talked about the filing of the track and then to glue it in place, and to prevent the track from bending and to really sit right in the foundation, I really had to use a screwdriver to really push it in to make sure it was sitting straight up and not on an angle. And I really used this little guy a lot just to check, and at some point just to leave it on there while everything was gluing. Now whilst I do this, you see there's some wiggle room in here. So the gluing of the turnout is very important, obviously, and the positioning and where to cut it off. It says in the description to cut it off at, was it 238 mil from the end? Frankly speaking, I just put it exactly on top, remove the float, made with the pliers, indent again where it has to be cut, took turnout away, cut it four times, and then glued it in place. But this is very important. Note when this guy goes up or down, the position changes a little bit as well. But once we put here these bars in place, and you push this a bit more snug, you just get everything positioned and lined up right, then this is a bit more solid, in this more solid position. Now I did need to add a shim to one of these guardrails because it just wasn't keeping the wheels on the track, and it kept popping out. So that's the track, that's how I do it. It's not too difficult. I'm going to weather or paint the track rusty after I glue it. I don't want to have more paint interfering with the glue process. I want to put it on like this, make sure everything runs, and then paint it. And for that I go back to the first initial base coat 50-50 mix of burnt umber and burnt sienna, and I just leave it at that coat. And I paint the sides really to ensure that there's no shimmering rails left, and then I use a piece of wood to clean off the top of the track. And just a final layer, what I'm doing is to just sprinkle on some black dots. So you really want to be careful with this method because you can easily overdo it. So first, before I brush, I always do it here on a piece of paper just to make sure I avoid these massive splurges of paint. And that was it. Easy, wasn't it? Just start with a base coat, then add your lighter shade, add your darker shade, and that's it. And if you really mess it up, you can always just put another base coat on it and just start again. So if you want to see how I finish the car float or paint the apron, check the videos that you see on your screen right now. Thank you guys all for watching. That's it for today. Bye bye.